This afternoon, we've got some really good panel discussions coming up, a couple of guest speakers to start. However, going to set the scene. Got a couple of scientists from AgResearch, and I'd just like to bring to the stage Dr. Jim Webster and Dr. Cheryl O'Connor from AgResearch. So Dr. Webster is the Animal Ethics Office Leader at AgResearch. He has expertise in animal ethics, animal welfare, agriculture, standards and auditing. His inspiration is to improve the lives of people and animals, and to do this in a creative and enjoyable manner. Some career highlights are leading the animal welfare and animal ethics teams at AgResearch, developing welfare standards and auditing for global animal partnership, and serving on boards and committees working alongside enthusiastic, passionate people. He's contributed a unique perspective and sense of humour to his professional work. Outside of work, he enjoys cycling, watercolour painting, outdoors and music. Dr. Cheryl O'Connor is the Animal Behaviour and Welfare Science Team Leader at AgResearch, based at Ruakura. She's been an animal behaviour and welfare scientist for 30 years, applying that knowledge to improve the welfare of animals and ensure a social licence to operate for farmers in the wider primary industries. Prior to this role, she was a program leader at the Ministry for Primary Industries. She's assisted and advised the National Animal Welfare Advisory Committee in the development of animal welfare standards, working collaboratively with individuals and groups across the extreme spectrum of views on New Zealand's animal welfare system. Dr. O'Connor holds a Bachelor of Agricultural Science honours degree from Lincoln University, followed by a PhD from Edinburgh University. Welcome to both of our scientists. First up, I'd like to have Dr. Webster present. I'll give you some space.
Thank you. Great, thank you for the opportunity to talk to you about animal research. So what I want to talk about today is how research on animals is controlled, and then a little bit about social license. We've heard something about that through the conference so far. Animal research is dependent on social license. Specifically, I'd like to talk about a new initiative in research called Openness, and then a little bit of a thinking exercise about applying animal research exercises to farming. Some things that AgResearch is doing with regard to animal research, and then we'll wrap it up. Throughout the presentation, I've posed some questions for your thought. These, you might find them provocative. I've designed them that way because it's the after lunch session. They're rhetorical questions, so you don't have to shout out the answers. You can talk to me later if you want. At the outcome I'd like is for you all to have a deeper understanding of how animal research is controlled and what animal research does to maintain social license. As I said, we depend on it. And then stimulate some thinking about any of the things that are done in animal research have value to the primary industries. The first thing you might be thinking is, why is animal research important to me? And I think, as you heard, even the minister said that said that research is important. And I strongly feel that animal research has underpinned the success of the primary sector so far. They've really joined tightly together, and it will continue to do so. However, animal research continuation is dependent on social license to do it, and so is farming animals. So it's useful to think about and understand how animal research is controlled. Well, it is controlled differently to farming. It's a completely different part of the Animal Welfare Act, and that defines how research must be approved by an animal ethics committee before a researcher can start. And the makeup and operations of that committee are all stated in that Animal Welfare Act. So there's a first question here: would you rather be a research animal or a farm animal? Most people would think farm animal, maybe, peaceful out there on the farm. Well, but really, do you know enough to make that decision yet? So let's look deeper into the control of animal research in New Zealand. As I mentioned, it's centred around these animal ethics committees. The animal ethics committees approve research based on a harm-benefit decision. They assess the harm by what's called an impact grade, and harm must be reduced in the law by applying the 3 Rs. And I'll talk about those a little bit more detail. So harm versus benefit. That's how ethics committees assess whether a researcher applying to do research is justified to do so. They weigh up what the likely harm of that research will be versus the benefits that the researcher is promising to deliver. So the questions the committee has to ask is, can the degree of harm be justified by the outcomes? If it can, then that approach helps the people who are the researchers, the people causing the harm, and also the people concerned about what is happening to the animals. Impact grade, that's if you like, a common currency. It defines what the impact of the research to the animals are. And it goes from A, which is no impact or virtually no impact, to D or E, which is very high impact. And for comparison, a lot of farming practices would be in the A or B category. If behaviour starts to be constrained, for instance, in mud or where there's low lying, it might get into C, and then surgical procedures would be in the D area. The other thing that research has to deal with is applying the 3 Rs, and that's stated in the Act, and researchers must use this principle when undertaking research. Before they can even start, they've got to consider whether they could achieve the research without an animal at all. Then if they can't, they've got to reduce the number of animals, and they've got to refine what they're doing to the animals to reduce the impact on the animal as much as possible. But wait, there's more. There's additional aspects of research oversight that animal ethics committees have to deal with. If they don't all agree, then things don't get approved. It's a consensus situation. They also have to determine if the researchers are competent, they have to monitor those people doing the research, they have to monitor the facilities and the projects. And they've also got to determine whether the researcher can actually achieve the results that they're promising to do. And interesting, in the Act, it also says that the committee can consider any other aspects that it thinks is relevant. So the process of doing research on animals is clearly designed to be rigorous. And is that level of oversight justified? Could society ever expect a similar level of oversight for farming? It's a high bar for research. Well, what's the possible reasons? Well, one is that the potential manipulations could be very broad. It's whatever the researcher decides to apply for. And if deemed justified, the impact of those on the animals could be quite high or severe. There's also another major aspect in terms of research, and that is a low public understanding. Research is usually hidden away. How many have been into a research laboratory? The results are usually hard to access or understand. Scientists write in a completely different language in places you never find. And animals are very rarely mentioned or given recognition. So, the acceptability for research might be lower than for producing animals for food. And that perception of secrecy may have led to that mistrust. It's obviously science deems that doing research is not a right, and it's put a high bar there. And that perhaps suggests that there's a low level of trust for researchers. But then, as I've shown you with the grades, why is a researcher different from a farmer? In reality, in research, that high bar for approval and the fact that you have to apply those 3 Rs has meant that high impact research in New Zealand is actually very rare. And if you look at figures for New Zealand in 2019, only around 3% of all animals used in research had a high or very high impact. For AgResearch, it was even lower. And in 2020, only 0.15% of animals were in that category. And there was no very high, they were in the high category. So 86% of all the animals used in research at AgResearch experienced little or no impact from the research. That brings us to openness and social license. Don't ever think that the public will get less concerned about animals in your care. Concern has only ever gone in one direction, and that's as we know more about animals and their capacities and their feelings, the public has only ever got more concerned about their care. Now, if you aren't being proactive and adding another voice to why you do things to animals, your license could be eroding without you knowing it. And in today's world, openness is coming whether you like it or not. As well as social license, there's another aspect there that we have a responsibility in both research and farming for the people in our industries to feel valued and supported in their work. And openness is designed to affect that, and increasing social license is designed to impact the lives of those people working in the industries. So you can ask yourself, can you maintain social license without explaining what you're doing and why? And if we don't maintain social license, then how do we create attractive careers for people in our sectors and help reduce issues like compassion fatigue when people are doing things to animals that might be high impact and they don't know the reasons for? What if social license for research and farming declines? Well, it did in the UK. In the 1970s, animal research extremism was on the rise. Organisations like ALF were actively attacking research institutions in both the UK and the USA. There was a sudden drop in public acceptance for research between 2010 and 2012, and that had animal research institutions very concerned about their continued license to operate. So what they did was develop what they called a concordat on openness. And that was an agreement of organisations to be more open about what they were doing with animals and why, because they felt it was that secrecy and the closed doors that was causing that slipping support. After that, public support for research stabilised. But you can never underestimate the effect of a crisis. And recently with COVID-19, support for animal research in the UK in a recent survey went up to 73% support. So that's interesting. Is that a case of animal research is good, but only when you really need it? Or is it an example of the public themselves doing this sort of harm benefit assessment about possible impacts of COVID versus the effect on the animals of the research? Either way, it does demonstrate that social license can change quickly, and we'd better pay attention. So what we're doing in New Zealand in terms of research is adopting an agreement which is very similar to the Concordat in the UK. We're calling it the Agreement on Openness in Research and Teaching in New Zealand. And it has 5 commitments so that organisations that sign up to this agreement agree to follow those 5 commitments. I won't read them out, but they broadly state that we're going to be clearer about what we're doing with animals and why. We're going to communicate more. We're going to provide opportunities for the public to find out more, and we're going to report on that annually, and a report that will be publicly available. So a number of organisations have already signed up to that. AgResearch is one of the first, and a lot of the major universities and that have already indicated they're signing up. That agreement will be formally launched later this month in Queenstown. And one of the first questions organisations have is, what does it look like? Well, as I mentioned, those commitments are very broad, so it's up to the organisation how they do it, but it's about increasing your communication and being more open. Importantly, it needs to be honest and not one-sided. Otherwise, it just looks like a promotional exercise. Openness isn't about complete transparency, and that's what's worried some organisations. It's not about open your doors and letting people wander through your labs, going to upset the animals, whatever it is. It's not about any of that. It's about the organisations themselves are in control of managing it. There is a number of benefits that we anticipate. Again, social licence is one, but also that aspect of increased reduced compassion, fatigue of staff, increased resilience, decreased staff turnover, and in the end, better animal care, better research. So AgResearch is right behind that, and we've been meeting these commitments for over a year now. We have a public policy statement on our website for over a year about how we use animals. We've made our operating manual for our ethics committee available, and we've got information about what we're doing with regards to the 3 R's. Providing information. This is the basis for this is on our website. So this is our public website where all that information is held, and you can find out more about what AgResearch is doing from that website. So when I was thinking about this, I thought, well, what about some of the other research approaches, and could they be useful to primary industries in this audience? There is a perceived double standard, as I mentioned. For example, if we take castrating animals, it's routine on farms, but it would be graded very highly in research, and there'd be a lot of controls. So why is that? And why would the same procedure causing the same level of harm be considered differently in research versus farming? And well, will society keep accepting that? There's this difference, and the animals in farming may experience more pain than if they're used for food than in research. What if there was greater control in farming? So would any of the research approaches help? And I'm not advocating one or any of these, but I thought they're worth thinking about. So harm benefit, as I mentioned, would that help explain what is happening on farms and why? The impact rating system, that common currency to explain how animals are impacted in your farming systems, would that help in discussions? What about the overarching principle? A defined approach to, or philosophy about how farming approaches the use of animals. Would that help? And then finally, openness, being more open about what's happening, engaging with the public. Well, you have to consider that social license. So our perspectives, we in AgResearch, we understand that doing research on animals is a privilege that society gives us, and we are going to operate responsibly and be open and accountable. We'll only do research on animals if there's no alternatives, and we'll minimise the harm whenever possible. We have taken a number of initiatives. We're leading the way in a number of areas. We've just made our animal use details available on our public website for the first time in New Zealand, I believe. And we've started doing things like rehoming animals, which really helps staff positive benefits and understanding when animals can be rehomed after their use. We've also broadened our harm benefit assessment, including impact to humans of the research and the wider ethical and environmental impacts of the research. And as you've seen, we've signed up to Openness. So finally, social license for animals is essential. Domestically here, freedom to operate, and internationally for farming. Openness is coming, it will be expected. Harm benefit of farming animals could change with better and cheaper non-animal protein sources, and that's already been mentioned. There is going to be pressure for both research and farming to be more ethical, environment, and sustainable. And we need to attract motivated people to our industries. And, as I said, research and primary industries are tightly linked. We can lead the way in this. We've done it before with a lot of our legislation, and why not? So if you're not moving forward, you're going backwards. Thank you.
Cheryl.
So animal welfare, I just wanted to start. There's been a lot of talk about journeys, and this animal welfare is a journey, not a destination. It's a classic quote from the late David Behaviour, who led animal welfare in New Zealand. But as with many of the speakers, we're talking about a journey. And one of the things Jim already said, but I want to emphasise the expectation about the level of animal care has only ever increased, and it's going to continue to increase. We have increased scientific understanding, of course, and we've got growing expectations of the proof of what customers want to see. And part of that is the realisation about sentience. And we in New Zealand are one of the first to actually include sentience in our Animal Welfare Act in 2015. So what is sentience? You see this animal and you can understand and respect that they are able to perceive and experience situations. They actually have sensations, but it's true for all animals, including our farm animals. Now, these experiences are then amalgamated and interpreted. That is the awareness, that's the awareness of the situation, which is critical for sentience, and that results in emotions. And emotions can be positive, such as comfort and pleasure. They can be negative, such as pain and boredom and fear, or they can be neutral. So you can understand that. And the term Valence just means that. The scientific term of valence just means that emotions can be positive, negative, and neutral. So emotional states drive how an animal actually responds to a situation, whether that be by instinct or, in fact, reasoning and decision-making. So ultimately, it's the animal's interpretation of the situation that matters. And we can't just infer this from simple measures. We can no longer say that an animal is highly producing or healthy, therefore their welfare is fine. Some of you may have seen this before, but I just want to reiterate our definitions and the universally in the science world consideration of what is animal welfare. Biological function and health is the animal healthy and productive. Naturalness is about natural living. Now, that's not just our natural environment of being in pasture-based systems, but it's actually about naturalness for the animal as well. Is the animal able to perform their natural behaviours? Can a sheep be a sheep? Can a cow be a cow and do their cow things? An affective state is actually how the animal experiences its life. So we've defined animal welfare as a human concept, but really what we're looking at, it's about how the animal's feeling about these situations. That's critical. So biological function, food. Food is important, food is important. It's not that hard. Humans, animals, we have the luxury of grass for a lot of ours. Water is essential. Clean, palatable water, also essential for animals. Shelter. A house provides us protection from the elements and gives us comfort. It's the same for animals. This does not mean they have to be housed, but they still need protection from the weather, for shade and for shelter, and get a level of comfort and well-being from these being provided. I don't think this is a COVID vaccine, but you get the principle. Health is a fundamental part, good health, and it's not just treatment, it's actually providing preventative care. Naturalness, similarly, we understand about the natural environment, enjoying being out there, and it's a New Zealand advantage for our pastoral industries. We already have that naturalness ticked off. Now, affective state, how does an animal experience its life? You can see they're with their mothers, they're playing, they're with social contact. It's all of those elements that the pictures just convey. That is how an animal is experiencing its life. Now, there is a difference in stakeholder views and values. Consumers generally value natural behaviour and happy animals. And traditionally, health and production are seen to be the industry focus. Now, I've got here that science must address all these value-based concerns, but I know from the conversations and the presentations, even at this conference, it's not just about science. You're all recognising that we have to cover all of these values. The consumer has those values, then we have to address them so that, and provide the assurances so that our practices are widely accepted. So what's animal welfare science doing? Animal welfare science is changing too. Basically, for the last 30 years, our research has been focused on eliminating the negatives, making sure that we get practice change on farm. But now we're looking at how we can show the positives of what is our natural pastoral farm systems. We're well aware that for animals to have a good quality of life on our farms, we need to go beyond that minimising the negative to actually providing them with a life that is filled with positive mental experiences. And animal welfare assessment is changing with that. The 5 freedoms I've listed here are the principles of what's in the Animal Welfare Act to provide the duty of care. But more recently, Professor David Mellor from Massey University has led the 5 domains, which is being utilised internationally. And you can see that the first 4 match across similarly: nutrition, environment, health and behaviour. but critically, it includes the mental state. The fifth domain includes the mental state. Here's some technologies that we're using. They're not as out there as some of the work, but just to give you a flavour of some of the work that we're doing. These are GPS collars on sheep, so that we can actually know to great detail where they are, where they're moving, where they're spending their time. But just as importantly, don't know if you can see the little red one there, that's a proximity sensor. So that's actually about the social environment. That's telling us who they're spending time with, what their social networks are. This work is being done particularly with ewes and lambs, looking at mothering, but we've also started some work with mating behaviour, looking at the rams and ewes. This cow has electrodes on her head. This is because we're looking at sleep. Sleep is really important. We know how important it is for humans. How do you actually get, this is electrodes, how do you actually get to understand on a farm animal, let alone in situations where the farm animal is? We can't just bring them into a sleep clinic and let them stay there nice and controlled to measure all the brainwave patterns. So we have a range of things. You can see an accelerometer, they're used a lot. Just tells you if you're lying or standing, those kind of activity things, like a little bit like a Fitbit, used a lot. The electrodes are under the hood here, but also there is a muscle mesh here, and on this girth is a heart rate monitor, but similar to those, just to get the principles of how we might understand and measure all of these things to get an idea about sleep. Camera technologies, this is not the same cow, but a similar cow on the sleep study. The ability to actually see what's going on at night. Now you can see some things, but actually to have the detail to be able to see clearly in behaviours is really important, and the technologies are just improving so much. We also have infrared cameras, not only measuring that, not only because they're measuring the temperature, actually show different emotional states as well. But having said that, I'm just showing a drone, and I know it's not about herding animals or mustering cattle, but it is also about camera technology, because it turns out, even though you want that closeness or where you can see, if you're talking about a paddock or a bigger situation, to be able to get a good view and be able to see where animals are, it actually becomes easier to have it, and very clearly you can see the animals there. Now, you don't have to worry about all the details, but this is just to remind me to talk about machine learning and modelling, the ability to actually take this information and use machine learning and technology to actually help us and model and train computers to do this, rather than have a whole lot of staff and students reviewing thousands and millions of loads of data. But just like your Fitbit, we still do need to do behaviour observations. Now, if your Fitbit tells you that you did a whole lot of, tells me that you did a whole lot of steps yesterday, I don't know if that's because it was nice and sunny and you got here early to Christchurch to have a nice walk round, or in fact, it's because actually you were fogged in and you were late getting in here, you were stressed about what was happening, and you went racing around the place in a complete idiotic state of mind. The number of steps is the same, but your state of mind is quite different. So we still need, there are still measures that we need to do. And just to give you an example, we do actually do some stuff about affective state. This is not whether she'll sit on the chair. This is classic novel object. We also do novel human tests. And similarly here, this is a barrier test. So this is a little bit about state of mind, where if you put the barrier up, are they inquisitive? Are they fearful? Do they just move around it? And this can change depending on the state of mind of the individuals, of the cows at the time. So what do these next steps in the animal welfare journey actually mean for what we'll see on farms in the future? We're doing the science now to provide the evidence that supports those consumer expectations so that we maintain social license to operate and be able to provide the assurances that our outdoor pastoral farming is providing the needs and wants for animals to have a good life. Now, as so many have said, we realise that we actually can't provide you with that knowledge and those answers if we don't do that research. Thank you.
Right, I've already got some questions here, so I'll just launch straight in if that's okay. Following straight on, Cheryl, from that presentation, how do we establish natural behaviour for an animal? Would you have to release it back into the wild and observe it, or can you extrapolate stuff by observing it in farmed situations?
No, you can, yeah, you can extrapolate from being in farm situations, particularly our farmed animals are quite domesticated, though there's still some fundamental naturalness to it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Jim, New Zealanders are generally pretty proud of their animal welfare standards, but there's a question here. Recent global research by NZTE shows New Zealand is not highly renowned for its great animal welfare practices. Why do you think this is?
Yeah, there was, our gradings did slip from an A, I think, to a C, I think. Yeah, so, yeah, and that was, I think it's the World Association of Animal Protection does that grading. And it's based on a lot of different things, right, from the legislation and to you know what's happening. And I think a lot of it is to do with New Zealand's really regarded for having good legislation, but perhaps under-resourcing the ability to monitor what's happening out on farm in terms of that meeting that legislation.
But I'm wondering too, how much of that is perception versus reality on farm?
Yeah, well, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, what level of impact does the halter collar have when it comes to animal welfare? Has there been any studies done or any thoughts around that?
Yeah, well, that's interesting. That's about a specific product that's been developed by a company. You know, I don't have any more information about that than what's publicly available on their website. And everything else is, you know, is the company's domain. I think that generally that technology is very interesting, and if it works well, it would have a lot of positive benefits for being able to, you know, move animals, you know, without, you know, stressing them out, you know, necessarily. Depends on how you're going to move them with dogs or whatever. You know, you can. It has a lot of add-on aspects to it, where you can monitor the animal's perhaps health or physiology, so you can keep an eye on it that way. So it definitely has potential if the training aspect, I think, is one of the concerns about if that works well. Then yeah, it definitely could have advantages. I think one thing we have to be careful with all of those technologies is they don't take away from the farmer's ability to be a stock person. And we don't want to go to a situation where we're totally farming by phone without looking at the animals.
Yes, quite right. MPI will not allow lame animals to be humanely slaughtered at meatworks. So often they remain lame for long periods as they recover on farm. Is this a humane policy?
Well, yeah, and this is a good example where a harm benefit assessment would really help you decide that, because you know you're making these trade-offs about what you're doing with the animal on farm and when you take that action about lameness. I mean, we all know that when an animal limps, it's feeling the same pain as what happens if you and I limp. There's no doubt about that. But you know what the best action is for that animal. There's a whole lot of other circumstances that will come into play. Yeah.
How do we balance the needs of the animals with keeping our people who work with them safe?
Yeah, well, that's that's part of animal welfare, is caring for the animals, caring for the land, caring for the people. It's one of the elements, and it's including both. But if you're looking after the animals, have good routines, good handling, then, and the animals are not stressed, the animals are not frightened, the animals are not, then that also helps with people's safety and how they're working with the animals. And there's there's been quite a few, a little bit like the compassion, people actually unsure about changing a practice or how they handle, how they work with animals. And then once they've gone through the change, they see the benefits in the animals, which then makes them happier and sees benefits for them as well.
Mm-hmm.
So that there is, if you get that right, you actually get both sides, you get well-being for both the human and the animals.
Yeah, I think there's one aspect comes to mind is removing horns and antlers. And, there's ways to do that are more humane. Obviously, they are taken off for both human safety sometimes and animal safety, but they're also taking off removed for other reasons, such as making some of our management techniques easier. So I think we've got to look at that carefully and maybe change management around some of those things where, we can manage animals with horns. Again, those are big issues that, may involve going outside the box to try and answer and how we farm animals.
Great. Oh, some good questions coming through. Is there any research or studies going into calf psychology? This would be really beneficial for calf rearing.
Yes. You saw calves playing. I mean, it's a classic one. Done papers published, isn't it, from Heather's, basically comparing, giving them a whole lot of things and rearing surfaces as opposed to a plain pen, and actually measuring their well-being, but actually measuring that anticipatory behaviour, the kind of glass half full, glass half empty approach, actually thinking about that and the bias with calves, and quite strongly a difference where they had actually stimulation in a nicer environment, and you could actually see all of, but a classic for any young animals is if you're seeing play, things are not too bad. Doesn't mean that there's not other things, but if things are not good, you're not going to see play behaviour. It's a very powerful tool, reasonably simple.
There's some good work that shows rearing calves well will have benefits right through the life of that animal. And that starts right with its cognitive development. And there's work showing that rearing calves in isolation, for example, isn't very negative. And we've done some work showing rearing calves outside can have some potential benefits as well in terms of preparing animals for more variable environments.
How can you assess behaviour with objects attached to them that could add an annoyance or discomfort factor, like wearing shoes? Surely it must be relief to them getting them off those objects. Wouldn't it just be simpler just to observe?
In theory, it's simpler to observe, but how much you're wanting to observe, how many animals, and then how many hours it takes to then, even of your video, to record that. If you don't have a suite of students to do that, it's one of the things, particularly with ethics, and we have quite a lot of, when there's new equipment, have to work out how best to do it, but there's a lot of work, done a lot of work to make sure about how we do that there's not irritation, and in fact that it doesn't change your key behaviours. I mean, even putting something on the leg, you want to know that actually you do the validation to be sure that you're not then changing, that they don't actually like that, so they don't lie down, so that totally alters your observations. But yes, that's why a lot of those things, they're for research. They're so that we can ask some questions to then be able to have the proxies or make the inferences so that you then can be used. It's not not about actually fitting out all of the animals with devices. Yeah.
How can we demonstrate taking a calf off a dairy cow at birth is more beneficial than leaving it on cow? This will be a very helpful answer if you can get this for us.
So I'm not quite sure what I should say here. That's not very. I don't know the answer. I will tell you that actually keeping calves on cows is the thing that's going around internationally in animal welfare and for dairy, particularly Canada, North America, Europe. We have done a little bit of work. We are keeping a watching brief. There is what is the benefits to both the calf, and there's quite a lot of work to show there's benefits for the calf. There is less to show the benefits for the cow and the timing, but there are a couple of very big international programs that have just started. So we are looking to get that information rather than it's quite a big piece of work. And I do know, but that does also mean for New Zealand when you're talking about pastoral systems, which probably is less of the issue, changing it to a pastoral system than actually the seasonality, the numbers game and the seasonality, but how you could actually change that. But yeah, I mean, we don't have the answer, but as I say, because we're keeping an eye on what's going on, it's a big thing overseas. It's kind of the next thing coming, which then if they do it in their systems, they'll suddenly be saying, why aren't we? And we're that much cooler.
Yeah, and some things the public have a perception of.
Yeah.
It'll be very hard for science to counter that when it just is intuitive to the public.
Yes.
You know, it would take a strong, series of science to sway that.
Yep, one of the challenges our sector has. Look, we've run out of time. Thank you very much to Cheryl O'Connor and Jim Webster.
Thank you.